Welcome. Welcome to the philosophical webinar organized by Berlin Practical Philosophy International Forum. Today's topic is justice and injustice in practice of life. So I hope we will all enjoy this discussion and this philosophical mythic and dive in deep to this philosophical question and topic. My name is Maja Nestroy. I'm honored to be a host of this webinar, or more even representing the Berlin Forum as a chairwoman. I'm also the technical assistant here during the webinar, so I will help also our guests and speakers today, as well you, our audience, how to manage all of that, all of our software and equipment. Traditionally, today is with us Chris Skowroński, a professor of philosophy at Apollo University, among others, author and organizer of series of conferences, American and European Values. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yes, happy to see you, happy to have you. You will be, as always, we can say also, the moderator of our philosophical discussion. And right now I have honor and real pleasure to introduce our guest by whom I'm personally also highly inspired, and not only because she is a female scholar and female philosopher, but also because in her books and papers I found a lot of well-organized and well-written philosophy which address problems of everyday lives, but also some of the challenges which are important or present in our modern world. So I'm happy to introduce today a professor and the chair of philosophy department at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, USA, Shannon Sullivan. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be talking with Chris and to be in dialogue with you as well, Maya. Should I go ahead and dive in, Chris?
It's like 1 minute right now for technicalities.
Okay.
Technicalities, it's like for you viewers, our audience, if you have any kind of questions, please just write here in the chat box on the right side. And also, if you are a viewer on YouTube, just don't hesitate. If you want to dive into a discussion with us or just engage, please just put your comment below. We will be happy to answer. We will be happy to refer to that later on. And right now, if you know the technicalities, maybe the short outline, our webinar will have 3 parts. First of that, it will be the mini lecture delivered by Shannon Sullivan. Then we will have a short discussion between Chris and Shannon, and then you can all pose the questions, and we can just ask our speakers, our philosophers today, about our reflection, or just, interact philosophically. Okay, so before diving to the mini lecture, I have, Shannon, here 2 books from you. One is probably one of the first, and it's Living Across and Through Skins, Transactional Bodies, Pragmatism and Feminism. And the second is co-edited by you, but I found there in introduction, written by you, a very nice sentence, and it has long been recognized that the task of living well and justly has a special relation to the project of philosophy. I loved this sentence, and I hope it will be nice opening for your lecture, and I'm waiting for it. Passing the microphone.
So thank you. Well, if I pick up with that sentence, it makes me think way back to the days of Socrates and Plato, of course, but it also reminds me, this has always been important to me as a pragmatist philosopher and as a feminist philosopher, or just a philosopher in general, that philosophy has to be connected with practical everyday issues and lives. And I've always found it most exciting when it does that. So justice is one of those issues, and as strange as this might sound, I think sometimes it's easier to focus on injustice. Sometimes the harder I find that I try to define what justice is, the more I think about what justice is, the more difficult I think it is to figure out a satisfactory definition. A lot of my work has focused not so much on defining justice, but in identifying injustices, particularly around issues of gender and race, and as those intersect, also with class and wealth issues. And I'm especially interested in how injustices of those types become embodied in our lives, and I mean very literally embodied, often can have health effects, both positive and negative, depending on who we're talking about. So things that can sound very abstract, like justice and injustice, can have very daily practical effects, not just on health, on interpersonal relationships, on things you see on television, in magazines. So the kinds of injustices that I've been most interested in are ones that I would call, they tend to operate a little more invisibly, so to speak. I characterize them as injustices that are shaped by unconscious habits. And so I'm using the word habit there in, not in, at least in English in the United States, there's a colloquial way we would use the word habit, like having a bad habit, like maybe I slump, or maybe I smoke, or there's some habit like that I want to get rid of. And I'm not using the term in that way, although those could be examples of habits, but I'm using habit in the sense of a tendency to engage and interact with the world in a particular way. And so these habits come to structure the way we think, the way we move, the way we interact with people, and in many times in today's world, they become structured by gender and race, by sexism and racism. The unconscious part of that phrase of unconscious habits has to do with the way that, and it's an interesting question, how I think a lot of this would extend outside of the United States, but I guess a lot of my work does tend to focus on the U.S., that we tend to think that in the United States, we tend to think, we are the land of the free and democracy, and supposedly there aren't big injustices, and they still are, and they tend to hum along. Sometimes they happen not because of people's bad intentions or their good intentions, but unconsciously, even though they're not intended. So I'm particularly interested in how interpersonally and bodily we enact quite a number of injustices in our life from day to day. Again, thinking about sexism, thinking about racism, thinking about white privilege and white advantages in the United States in particular. Some of my work most recently, this would not be in anything I've published yet, but there's a black folk aphorism, in African American aphorism, that says justice, when white people say justice, they mean just us. And so it's a kind of folk, sort of funny but critical way of indicating that in the name of very high ideals having to do with justice, with democracy, with fairness, that quite a bit of injustice operates side by side with that, and that things like justice have been primarily reserved for advantaged groups in our nation, in the United States, advantaged by class, advantaged by race, advantaged by gender as well. And that phrase sticks in my mind, and it makes me pause, not to be against justice, like that would be silly. Who in today's world could ever be against justice? But how and in what ways, in the name sometimes of trying to fight for justice, all sorts of injustices can go right along with that. And I do think that happens in the United States quite a bit. And some questioning of the typical tactics that in the United States, at least, that we've used to try and achieve racial justice, for example. And of course, the root of the word justice is around that word just, which has to do with law, and with the ability of the law to make things right. I guess if I had the most basic definition of justice, that would be it. the ability of the law and the administration of the law in order to eliminate wrongs, make things right. So two questions really pop up there. First of all, how do we figure out what's right? I mean, in some ways, we just begged the question. We have to ask, well, wait a minute, what counts as the right way a society should be arranged, or the right way that people should be treated? Our opinions on that have changed drastically over the years. And so, you know, we could talk some more about that in some detail later, if folks in the audience wanted to. So how do we figure out what counts as right? To what degree is that a secular decision, a religious decision, a moral decision? And then part two is, can the law do all the work that justice is asking it to do? Can law, and here I will just admit that I tend to think the answer is no, that law by itself cannot achieve the kind of transformation, personal, interpersonal, in terms of those unconscious habits. I don't think law by itself can achieve justice. So that's a very paradoxical thing I just said. And I'm not against trying to make change in and through laws, and many times, of course, that is necessary. Is it sufficient? I think the answer is no, and I think a lot of some of the recent dynamics going on in the United States right now in its presidential election season are symptomatic of laws that changed in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s. And we sort of thought, well, poof, the laws have taken care of racial injustice. That's gone in the United States. And now, supposedly, we don't have to think about that anymore. And I think we're seeing evidence that law by itself can't make the kind of change that's often needed. So I'm particularly interested in the ways that injustice functions alongside of laws that are supposed to help us achieve justice, but aren't always sufficient. And again, especially interested lately in race and class to think about those issues. I'm going to find out from you, Chris, what you think the audience would most want to hear about next in terms of talking about different sorts of ways of thinking what counts as right, or the right thing to do, or diving in more to talk about issues of gender and race in connection with justice.
Hey, Shannon, thank you very much. Well, I have a couple of questions. It seems to me, the first question seems to me that you define justice in reference to institutions rather than virtues of people, because you are saying that justice is something that ability of institutions to set the right wrong, right? And you are saying that law, justice by itself aren't so effective. There must be something else. Do I understand well? And so my question is it the problem of institutions, or rather it is the problem of virtues of particular people? It's number one. Number two, if we have the legal system, for example, and other institutions like education, like media, right, that are talking about justice, what about the people behind these institutions? So what is primary here, the institution or the people behind these institutions? What do you think about that?
Oh, that's a great question. And I mean, I think in the end, the answer is it has to be both together. Any sort of way of thinking about justice or injustice that just looks at one half of those, just only institutions or only the people, their virtues and vices, absent those institutions, each in many ways I think informs the other. Institutions get created and put together by people, and if institutions need to change, people are, well, they're interesting. You know, institutions can have a kind of momentum of their own sometimes, but if and when change is going to happen, it tends to be real live flesh and blood people who are going to work in those institutions, who are moving the pieces of paperwork around in those institutions, who are guiding the students or the patients or the clients or of whatever institution are there. So it always involves flesh and blood people. And my work, it's funny that you raised this question, because one of the gentle criticisms I get sometimes in my work is I actually don't tend to focus much on institutions. And I tend to focus on, I'm very interested in how the habits, or here we could think of the virtues, the predispositions, sometimes the vices, that constitute who and what we are as people. I'm very interested in those and how those are formed. And you're right, we can use the word, we could talk about a just person or an unjust person, and a lot of that would have to do with how one's habits, how one's character as a collection of habits is structured. So I think in the end it has to be both. And it's interesting how each one feeds into the other. So I do think institutions can help structure, for better or worse, the virtues, the habits that people are, that constitute people. And then once structured, those habits tend to impact institutions. Institutions sometimes remind me of something like big ships, a big yacht, sailing. They don't turn very quickly. Whenever they turn, it tends to be a kind of slow turn, but they can turn through the influence, the leaning of the institution, of the people on the ship, driving the ship. I guess the metaphor breaks down. So I think it has to be both. I don't know. I think it also can sometimes be helpful to, for functional reasons, to kind of focus on one versus the other. And so that happens in different conversations, in different people's work. It can help to really focus on just institutions or just individual people and their habits and virtues. But in the end, I think we have to see how all of those are linked in a constitutive way, that each is helping form and shape the other. And so it raises this question. In some ways, it's not the chicken or the egg question. Where do you start if you're wanting to make change? If you think a society is unjust in some way, where do you start? And I think in some ways the answer has to be in both places all at once. So yes, attempts to make institutional change, but if those institutional changes, including the legal changes, if that's not accompanied by the changes in people's more personal, interpersonal habits, their hearts, minds, and souls, as sometimes we say in English, if those kinds of changes aren't also happening, the institutional changes often can be subverted, undermined. Sometimes, my work focuses a lot on white supremacy and white superiority, and it has had a remarkable ability. If you look back over the United States history, going back about 300 years, it's had a remarkable ability to transform itself and adapt to different institutions. So it can't just be so think of chattel slavery, and this is often what people picture when they think of slavery. Even chains sometimes, people out in the cotton fields picking cotton. And when chattel slavery was eliminated after the Civil War in the United States, there was a brief 10 or 20-year period of panic on the part of many white slaveholders. Oh no, what are we going to do without slavery? And then no one puts it quite this baldly at the time, but then it's almost this realization, oh, wait a minute, it wasn't slavery that we white people who are invested in white superiority, it wasn't slavery so much that we needed, but we needed systems and structures of white supremacy and white superiority, and we can find new ones and different ones. And in fact, that's what happened with the birth of what was called Jim Crow, or legalized segregation. And the law itself, now not legal, so slavery's been outlawed, but the laws themselves getting used in a different way in order to ensure legalized segregation that advantaged white people. So then you fast forward to the 1960s, and those laws, or by and large in the 50s and 60s, those laws are eliminated. And My fear, frankly, is what we are seeing now is a repetition of a similar pattern where we think, oh, we've taken down that one institution, Jim Crow, legalized segregation. Oh, we're done. The problem's solved. And I think there's a transformation, a morphing going on where a kind of white superiority in the United States, or an assumed white superiority, is transforming itself and finding new institutions and new ways to continue. And it can seem to not be there, and then that's the part where it can seem invisible. But then because we're looking in the wrong place, we're looking, is there legalized segregation? Well, no. And so we think, oh, okay, so there's not any more issue of injustice toward people of color and a kind of system of white superiority that's built in. But we're looking in the old places rather than the new places to see where it continues to exist. And so in the midst of all that change I just described, a lot of white habits, a lot of white virtues and vices haven't been addressed or talked about or changed as much.
Yeah, I do agree that I think this relationship between individuals and institutions is very important here, and it involves also responsibility. We say that unfair people, unjust people should be responsible for, but what about institutions, right? And this borderline between who is responsible for what is really something that is not clear, and all the time we have discussions about that. But I have a questions of different sort about sensitivity as regards justice. Do you think, when you're saying about the United States, for many people outside of the US or North America is a kind of a wonderful example for the people outside of the US, because I know many Americans who would say, no, we have all the time problems, and so on. And my question is something like this. Do you think, is it true that the more justice we have, I mean, good habits, just habits, and so on, the more we are sensitive to injustice? In other words, the more justice we have, this high level of institutional justice, or more people with justice as virtue, right? Many people around, so we are more sensitive to injustices, and we multiply not injustices, but our understanding what is injustice. And why I'm asking this, because in the US, I think for many people outside of the US is a good example how to deal with injustices, something that is impossible in many countries outside. I don't know, in Africa, whatever. And what do you think when people in the US criticize America, for that there is a lot of work to be done? Sure, always there's going to be a lot of work to be done, but in comparison to other legal systems where individuals, minorities, and so on have no rights whatsoever, right? So do you think there's a kind of vicious circle? The higher level we have, the more injustices we detect around. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question about, in some sense, I don't want to say creating more injustices, but things that might have not been noticed before, if there's some sort of larger injustices that are eliminated, attention and energy is freed up to then notice the moderate level, or I don't want to call them smaller, but ones that just somehow the society didn't have time or energy for. Now there's sort of room or time or energy to look at those as well. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Yeah, it's funny. It's a funny thing being from the United States, because there's certainly a group of folks from the United States, and I mean, in some sense I put myself in that category, who like to be hypercritical of the United States. And I think it's fair to point out that sometimes we get some things right, and we're trying, and so it doesn't have to all be criticism. I mean, on the other hand, sometimes the strong criticism seems very much needed because we're not the only country that does this, but we're one of the countries who's like to brag so much about how much we are defenders of democracy, defenders of people's rights. And frankly, I think we often meddle in other countries' businesses because supposedly we have truth and we know how to bring people justice and we know what democracy is. And so there's a little bit of hypocrisy if we are claiming to model that, sometimes meddling in other nations to try and help them supposedly do this too, but often can't see the ongoing problems that we still have in our own society.
I do not think Americans do that only. Very frequently in Europe, in face of this crisis with immigrants, refugees, I've been hearing so many voices saying that the European Union is just not effective anymore, that this is the end of European Union, that this is a terrible area, this is the end of everything. At the same time, we have millions of people wanting to enter this terrible area, right? So I think kind of proud of European Union's values and so on, and I do not understand this criticism against European Union values, right? And I do understand that those people who are knocking at our door, for them entering this, I'm not saying paradise, but this highly institutionalized world, why they are coming, if maybe they have a sense that if they come here, their whole lives will be changed into good rather than into bad, right? There are some strong criticisms in Europe as well, and so I'm curious why it is so, especially that for many people Europe seems to be kind of paradise as regards, for example, justice. That they want to enter this this union because they hope that the institutions will take care of their concerns about equality, justice, and so on. But this is related to my next questions to you, because if we are talking about immigrants, I think immigrants at this moment, it is the most serious problem in Europe now. What about religious-based justice, understanding of justice in relation to this holy or sacred or special texts, religious texts, the Quran and the Bible, rather than constitution? If you ask many people, I have many students from Muslim countries, and very often they say that the constitutions, right, they are written conventions, but the Quran is something given by God, and of course, this is the right place to see the criterion or criteria for justice, rather than constitutions written by some, guys, important guys in parliament or something. What do you think about that?
That's a really tough one. You're right, because how does a society have some common source? It seems like there needs to be a common source that everyone can recognize as helping sort out when we conflict, when we have difficulties, when we disagree, when if what's good, what's right, what's against the law. That if we don't all recognize the same source of that judgment, it does seem hard to have the kind of stability then as a society. I think when you were talking about the folks wanting to come to Europe, and I think of migrants from South America and Latin America coming to the U.S. as well, sometimes I think that stability is, even if certainly everything's not perfect, but the stability there and the institutions you're referencing are a big part of that. How do you have that stability if there's not, and I'm not even saying which common source it is, but what if we have different competing models of how to solve these basic questions about what's right? So, it seems easy to give a secular answer. So that's been the route that Rawls and a lot of folks have gone. And certainly separation of church and state in the United States and other places says, well, we can't appeal to any sort of religious authority because no one agrees on that. So that's why we'll create the secular authority in order to do that. I think that, so, I mean, really my main answer to your question is it's a hard one and I don't know. And I'm uncomfortable just giving a secular answer because people's passions belong in the public sphere, I think. And for many people, those include religious passions and religious feelings. I would be very concerned about a kind of answer and it is a kind of Rawlsian answer of, sorry to just pick on him, but John Rawls, a political philosopher who, has been described as sort of having an allergic reaction to religion when he thinks of political structures, and that just really, they have no place in any kind of public sphere. And I think I can't quite call it religious in the same way, but it turns secularity into its own kind of metaphysical position that's adjudicating the other metaphysical positions. Some are theological, some aren't. So I'm not happy with that answer, but I will admit it's hard. What if you have, I'm going to use the word metaphysical now, not so much as jargon, but just to kind of talk about both secular and religious ways of thinking about where does authority come from and which one of those do we use to adjudicate in our society. I don't know what we do and we can't decide on one of them. Your
You
question?
are a pragmatist philosopher, right? So from
I
the point of
am.
view of pragmatism, it would be secularity as a kind of answer, right?
I think that would be the answer for most of the canonical pragmatists, and I am not happy with that answer. I want, in a pragmatist spirit, I want a creative third option. I don't want to say, yes, just follow whatever religious authority you want and the heck with whatever anyone else says. I think a kind of hyper-secularity that, in effect, bans religious passions and feelings from the public sphere or having relevance, I think that's very problematic. I think that's problematic as well. But it's hard to find what the third answer is, or some kind of creative third option. I'm also reminded, and this would make this would be a source that other pragmatist philosophers who would be interested in a secular answer, they would have to pause and take note of this too. So I think of Martin Luther King in the 1960-something. He's in jail in Birmingham, and he's writing the letter from the Birmingham jail, and he's been put in jail because of sort of nonviolent resistance that he was engaged in at the time against Jim Crow or segregation laws. And he writes about how he's been criticized for breaking laws, and that how can he, a minister, a man of God, do this and encourage other people to do this. And he makes a distinction there between just laws and unjust laws. And right there it raises your question in a form that, of course everyone today thinks Martin Luther King was right and he did the right thing, but he points out that he was doing all sorts of things that were illegal, and he appeals to a higher court, so to speak, which had to do with his religious faith, to say that I'm going to follow the just laws, which are the ones, given by God, and that the secular laws on the books in the United States are unjust. I myself would not want to appeal to God there, but that's an interesting example of, we can't just say, oh, take the secular answer and write off a religious answer, when a canonical figure in the American tradition, American intellectual tradition, perhaps American philosophical tradition, himself makes this kind of distinction. And we would all agree today that those were unjust. Most people, I think, would in the U.S. that those were unjust laws. But on what basis? What basis do we say that?
I think it's the idea of human rights, kind of the third way or something.
Yeah, although I think that just maybe that gets us right back into the same question, though, since we'd have some religions that would have very different views,
Yeah.
would not accept an account of human rights, like do women have the right to own property? Do women have the right to education? That would be maybe an easier one. And what, who are the humans? Who count as the full humans who have these rights versus those who are kind of sub-persons or persons who don't have the same kinds of rights?
We take a
Yeah,
look of the history of the Western civilization. Most of the time, if I'm correct, and most of the places were undemocratic, right?
I think that's very true. Yeah.
So if we take a look at what the tradition says, some people take a look at tradition. Tradition is very important. Tradition in big portion says that people are not equal at all.
That's right. Well, when I was thinking about that lovely quote that Maya read at the beginning, and it made me think of Socrates and Plato, but it's always fascinating. So I think today, when I was thinking about what does justice mean, and I think most of us today would say something like fairness or equality, something like that. But Plato would have given a very different answer, which had to do with a kind of harmony and order. And you need to know what kind of person you are and what your place or your role in society is. And then justice occurs when everyone knows that and plays their role. That makes it sound like it's a game or something. I don't mean play in that sense. But, with the right sorts of habits and virtues, takes on the virtues of that role and doesn't try to be in the wrong place or take over someone else's role. So the well-ordered society is the just society, and that means people knowing who's the ruler and who's the craftsman and who's the soldier defending, and you don't. It's not equal opportunity for everyone to become a ruler or become a soldier or something like that. So it's a very different way, I think, than a lot of folks in the Western world have of thinking about what justice is.
Mm-hmm. I have a feeling that our viewers on YouTube, when they are watching, they would say or they would think that we are talking philosophically about abstract thing, and justice or injustice is just kind of excitement or feeling or anger about particular people having troubles in particular places. And do you think it's the psychological, I don't know, egoistic, egocentric, whatever, feeling is something that is basic for the feelings or understanding of justice and injustice for ordinary people, ordinary members of the public? They do not seem to think too much about the universal institutions or something. They are angry with the injustice they've met here at home, perhaps with the husbands, or perhaps at I don't know, at university or at work or with the bosses, and so on. And do you think it's the main source of anger for ordinary people? This particular situation in particular time at particular space, rather than thinking about just societies in general.
Oh, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And I find that interesting to tie it to emotions and the emotion of anger in particular. So that, and it fits also with, I was saying at the beginning, I think it's sometimes easier to find injustice, to spot an injustice. And you're right, a lot of times it's with anger, just being really angry that this just happened. And it's easy, that's an easier thing to spot or understand perhaps than seeing or defining what justice is. But concretely in practice, I think many of us feel like we see injustices or we experience injustices, and they have that lived emotional feel to them, often of anger. The interesting thing about anger, though, you're right, for someone to undergo, many feminists and other philosophers would say that the anger is really important there, because it in effect is what says this was an injustice. If it's a kind of way of demanding that other people recognize it as an injustice also. So someone, I guess I'm trying to think of a quick concrete example here. Um, one that doesn't seem too trivial, but if someone cuts in front of me in line or something, that's a little bit of a trivial example, but I might say that was wrong or it wasn't fair. And if I don't recognize that with some kind of, if I don't have some kind of indignation or anger, I think we would say, did I really understand or see it as an injustice at all? And the anger is both my expressing the injustice, but also demanding someone else in the society needs to also see this as an injustice so that we do something about it. I think usually there's some kind of expectation. Sometimes it's retribution. Someone needs to be punished if they've done something unjust. Or it could be more restorative, that there's been, with the unjust act, whatever it was, maybe less trivial than cutting in line, but there's been damage done to relationships in some way. And a need for restoring and repairing this kind of societal web that keeps us together in relationship. And what unjust acts do on this thinking is it's less that there's a violation of some kind of abstract right, but that the fabric, the social fabric that binds us together has been ripped a little bit, and we've got to find a way to repair it. And you have too many injustices piling up, and that fabric gets very frayed, and you lose the cohesion, you lose the stability of the society. Well, I saw maybe I liked the way that you brought up anger in connection with that, and anger as a demand, is a kind of claim, and a demand that a claim that something here has happened and this is wrong. And I'm claiming that you other people, whoever you are, friends, neighbors, the larger society, ought to recognize this as an injustice too, and not as something that just is appropriate for folks in my station of life, or folks in the way that we've got the society ordered right now. This should be seen as an injustice.
Yeah, well, I'm all the time thinking about this immigration thing when I could see the pictures, everybody saw them, when the immigrants coming from, in case of Europe, it's from Syria, Turkey, and Tunisia, Libya, and so on. In case of the US, the Hispanics, when they confront for the first time the borderline, when they see this luxurious places, hotels and beaches, and people having vacation time, the rich holiday makers and something, and they are entering this, and I'm thinking what they are thinking at this moment. Can't they have justified the anger that something is wrong, it is not just, that it's not fair that we have so rich, well-established countries. Some of them, some of these countries are post-colonial countries, right? And we have masses of people who have nothing. And do you think this anger in immigrants' minds would be justified in this case? That the white privileged, perhaps Western people have, I don't know, should we have some problems with our understanding of our past, or what? Or simply we are hypersensitive or too sensitive? I mean, the Westerners, maybe we are too sensitive, and which means we are perhaps disabled to see the right proportions. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think so. It's a hard question to answer, and I do think there's these increasing inequalities in wealth, certainly in the United States, and then I think that is happening also globally, where that the disparities are just getting greater and greater, and even if only for sort of self-interested, I'm hoping this isn't the only reason, but even if only for self-interested reasons of wanting to kind of protect a kind of stability, I think even the well-off in this unequal relationship need to be very concerned about how unequal it's getting, and how vast the chasm is, at least in the United States, between some groups of very poor people and very wealthy people. And in some of what's going on in the presidential nomination race right now, I think is being fueled by that, being fueled by this is too quick a gloss on what's going on, but some of it's being fueled by some very angry, poor white people saying, we feel like we've been dumped on for the last 30, 40, 50 years, and we're tired of it. And it's interesting, there's a lot of anger in the United States right now that some of the established politicians are trying to figure out how to manage and not have it sort of start to blow up or rip up established structures in the political system. It's going to be very I mean, in effect, it's funny, I don't think I've seen the word justice used exactly in that way, but if I pick up on what you were saying about anger, there is a very loud cry, angry cry right now of talking about an injustice going on in the U.S. that's tied around wealth, and it's wrapping in together issues of migration and race in very complicated ways. It's pretty volatile, and I don't know what the end of the story is going to be at this point either. So to the other question you were asking about, like, are we too super sensitive? I think what I worry about, I think I'd like to twist the question around a little bit more and say that we aren't at all sensitive enough or knowledgeable enough of a lot of history that went into making the way things are right now. I was reading a philosopher that we both enjoy, I know, or at least like reading. I was reading some of John Dewey's stuff, some of his material that he wrote right after World War I about the causes of World War I, about the League of Nations, which was supposed to, be this European, and also then the U.S. joins this body, that kind of international body that will bind together and help prevent other huge wars and huge upheavals. And of course we know that didn't work. But it is fascinating to read his work right around 1920 side by side with W.E.B. Du Bois's, who's also an American, in this case an African-American philosopher. He's writing in 1920 at the very same time about looking back on World War I, its causes, its structure. And I cannot tell you how radically different a picture you get of the war, and whether colonialism and the grab for colonial lands had anything to do with it. And it, I mention this as a way of needing to know more about our history, and that even going back to figures like Dewey and reading there, it's as if what was called the scramble for Africa back in 1885 that took place in Berlin, this sort of dividing up of Africa and the scramble, different European and the U.S. joins in at some point, although we weren't in Africa, but this scramble to prove that you're a world superpower, and how that was really tied to having colonies, and Africa in particular gets carved up. And Du Bois, it's not just a 21st century perspective looking back on that. It's Du Bois in 1920 seeing it, talking about it, and talking about the injustice there that leads to these wars. And so I worry less that I don't so much worry that we're too sensitive to injustices. I worry, especially in the United States, about the historical amnesia we have, about how things however things got to be, however they are today, that there are these deep historical roots that feed into this, and not understanding those, I think, gets in the way of figuring out how to have a more just situation.
my last question, because maybe Maya would like to say something, but my last question is, we are both teachers, actually, at university, right? Do you think education or university education has some role here? And what I'm thinking about is there's the word opportunity. I mean, do you think there's some connection between having more and more opportunities, for example, by means of education, and justice in this context would be that there are some people who limit the opportunities of other people? It would be injustice. And the justice would be making more space as far as more opportunities for other people is concerned. And do the teachers can do something about it, for example, but making the students conscious, I don't know, aware of or conscious of the possibility of having more and more opportunities to having happy life or prosperous life or just life or fair life and so on. What do you think about it? Do you think that the talking to students in the classroom can be instrumental here in doing something by us teachers to promote the idea of justice, you know, telling the students something? What do you think about it?
I do think so. I think yes, and then pretty quickly it becomes clear how politically important education is. And I don't mean politically important in the sense of making students think this particular thing about this politician or this, you know, law, but that how the polis, the society, is organized and wants to organize itself, is, and then how just or unjust that polis is going to be, is crucially tied to what kinds of education its citizens, its children and adults get. And, you know, is education just job training where you don't really ask critical questions, you just learn how to put the widget in and twist it? And there's, I work in the United States, there's way more looking at university education as, I'm just going in here to get this degree so I can get a job. Don't ask me questions about what the good life is. I mean, you know, you eggheads, you know, that's like, who cares about that? I just need the job.
The same in my country. The very same thing.
So, and of course, philosophers are flesh and blood people. We know people need food and we need a roof over our heads, and it's not that those material issues are unimportant, but it's exciting to be able to get students to sort of see that there's a moment, kind of a light bulb comes on, and seeing how education can be about asking certain questions about some of these words that can sound very old-fashioned, like virtues or what is the good life, but that and that there's no guarantee. It can be a very risky endeavor. There's no guarantee where those questions might take us, the teachers, them, the students. You know, whether that leads to conflict with their parents and their loved ones because they're asking critical questions now that they weren't. It can be risky, and we think of poor Socrates again, getting sentenced to death but he refused to stop asking questions. But so I mean, I think education is crucially important, and there's also, unfortunately, though, a way of managing it where I think it's less education and more just job training. And so you hope that it's doing both, preparing students to launch into some sort of career that they find fruitful, but that it's also giving them the ability and the interest to you know, ask questions that, you know, sometimes they sound abstract, but we really get into it. These are very, as you were saying, very practical questions about things that happen every day that they feel wrong or they make you angry, or they don't, but you're seeing someone else is angry, and then you know, rather than write that off as irrational, oh, that person's just irrational, pausing and going, wait a minute, that anger is a claim being made about a wrong. Now, I may or may not agree that it's wrong, but I can like stop and hear that anger and go, wait a minute, I need to ask some questions about this claim to justice that's in effect couched in that anger. So education's really crucial for getting that kind of thinking going, I think.
I agree that it can have, well, some practical impact for some people. I still believe that philosophy and education and the humanities have something to say about this. And actually, I think that many of these ideas of justice, human rights, a good life, and something, they are coming from the humanities, from philosophy, right? And they are well institutionalized, because we have in many universities, in the Western world, the idea, and perhaps we are conscious of these things thanks to philosophy, thanks to the humanities, and so this is the optimistic part of the of this conversation, that we have something, we have some role to do, right? Just
Right.
talking to students and showing them something. So.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Chris, for passing the microphone. Thank you for very fascinating discussion, which linked a little bit, I hope, at least for viewers, but also for us, all of us, this abstract or just this abstract notions, or like justice, because it may seem that this is just an abstract notion or a whole theory with actual the practice of life, because we were talking about practical and current issues which are bothering us, and as well in Europe as well as in the US. Okay, just ending this discussion, I would like to ask two questions which are formulated from a perspective of a lay person, only just to talk a little bit, not even in order to answer those, but to reconstruct them and to link those what we are thinking, like a lay person, like a people here, and connected that with this philosophical discussion or reflection. And the first question I gathered before the webinar was the questions we got: who does decide what should be classified as justice and injustice? Who is the judge outside the courtroom?
That's a great question. That's a very good question. Well, as a pragmatist, I'll say the context matters so much, and the situation matters so much, because sometimes you're talking about, claims to injustice. Maybe kids don't use those abstract words, but they certainly know what's fair and unfair, what they think is fair and unfair. And so sometimes, it's parents, sometimes it's teachers, it's friends, it's it depends on the situation. In some ways, though, it comes back to that really hard question that Chris was asking earlier about what if the people affected by the issue on the table, whatever the action was that's claimed to be unjust, what if those of us affected by that issue can't agree on who's going to adjudicate this? What are the standards of the way we're going to decide? And then, this reminds me, this is a strong point of Dewey, I think. He always reminds us how messy this is, and that's okay. It's going to be, the judge in the end is going to be us, us members in the society trying to talk and work it out. And it's going to be, having those habits and skills is important. It's probably going to be pretty messy in terms of not feeling like there's a very clear answer for how do we decide what was right and what was wrong in this situation. I hope that's it's a hard one to answer.
Thank you. No, just the aim is, just to translate all those questions we have. We can say, call it normal people, or just my generation which is living with social media. We ask themselves, to whom or to which values we should refer, deciding what is justice or injustice. You mentioned today in this discussion that actually you mentioned Luther, and it was the idea of breaking injustice laws. So what gives us right to decide which laws are injustice?
Yeah, that's a really tough question too. One thing that was interesting about the Martin Luther King example is when he broke those laws, he willingly went to prison, or he was in a jail, actually. It wasn't like a federal prison. But part of the nonviolent social action he talked about involved breaking the laws and then accepting the penalty that he knew would go along with them as a way of highlighting the injustice of the law. So there was a strange way in which it was respectful of the law and the community that he disagreed with, but in a way that generated discussion to try and, thinking about education here, Chris, try and raise that awareness, raise people's consciousness of, hey, is this law really fair or not? I mean, in the end, King as a minister probably believed that what was just there is what God would have wanted. In the end, though, what mattered was the society that he was part of in the United States, in the South. Was there a way for them to change their minds about what was just? And so his appealing to God, I don't want to say it didn't matter, but that's not what decided it. What decided it was this messy process of talking together as citizens of a country and deciding, ooh, yeah, right, that law wasn't just. But it's messy because I don't think everyone necessarily agreed with that. Some people did, some people didn't. And I would say the United States is still in a period of transformation. We tend to still have quite a bit of white superiority and white segregation built into our country, just not legalized in the same way.
Okay, and the last question right now, it's probably to both of you. It's like the question if the talking about the justice and injustice may be disturbing and maybe it's not wanted in the public, because knowing that somewhere is happening injustice, or knowing that we support in some way the injustice, because sometimes involving in some processes we're supporting more or less aware injustice. Maybe it is actually, maybe we just don't want to talk about injustice, supporting that, because I'm thinking about this example of clothes being made by children workers. So if I'm not aware of that, if I'm not aware that somewhere there is happening injustice, and I'm somehow indirectly supporting it, buying it at such low price, then maybe I prefer just not to know that, or not acknowledge that.
Yeah, that's actually, it's funny when you were saying that. I was thinking of a very similar example about clothing, and well, Chris, I'll see if you want to say something, and then I'll jump in. I've been talking.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a problem of engagement of some people in the name of some interest. So, of course, you are free to say nothing about such things, but do not expect that your anger will be heard of, or somebody will respect your view about different things. If you want to engage, if you want to show your opinion, if you want to articulate publicly your views on something, definitely there are going to be some people who would say that it's wrong or something. I think that we have at the same time many alternative ways or views about what is just, what is unjust. So the dialogue or talking means that we are having in front of us these alternative things, and we can discuss if religion-based idea of justice is better or worse, or more dangerous or less dangerous than secular based concept of religion, and we can talk about that. And of course, if we say, for example, I would say it's more risky for justice to rely on some chosen, given, particular idea of God or texts, because we have hundreds of different religions, and it is risky to rely on one of them, right? Because the other people, I mean, the beliefs of other religions would say, hey, we are discriminated. Why not us? So the idea of universal concept, controllable by some bodies, secular bodies, for me, in my opinion, is more, I would say, less risky. But of course, saying this at the same time, perhaps I'm creating enemies, and you know, people who would say, "Hey, what he's talking about? The Quran or the Bible is the right thing." So I think it is inevitable. If you want to be somebody in public life, inevitably you will be dealing or bumping into some views that are very different.
I guess the last thing I would say real quick was it's something you were saying, Chris, reminded me of it. I mean, I think for me it helps to think of justice less as a static thing or noun even, and think of it more as a process, that kind of messy process Chris was just talking, you know, this, when we're talking about it and trying to figure it out, that's when and where justice is happening, and it's never finished. Even figuring out what it is or how we're going to decide it is probably never finished, because the world changes and new things happen, and so that can sound frustrating, but and especially if we're looking for a place of purity where we've got it all figured out, we're never going to reach that. But if we're okay with some of the messiness and realizing, no, the process is when we can have the dialogue and the conversation, and as long as we can keep that going, even though there are a lot of differences we're having to talk through, you know, then we're engaged in a process of justice, or you almost want to use it as like an adjective or an adverb. You know, we're trying to justly live together in this sort of messy situation where we're trying to figure out, you know, what the best thing is to do.
I would like to finish my talking about this in showing or articulating my hope that it's not necessary. It's my hope it's not necessary to eliminate some important texts. I do believe there is a whole lot of wisdom in the Quran, whole lot of wisdom in the Bible, whole lot of wisdom in constitutions of different countries, whole lot of wisdom in basic books of the Western and Eastern and Southern worlds, and this may be this basis for everybody. This is my optimism. It does not mean that I want to kick out, I repeat that, some traditions or some basic books of some traditions. My optimism is that these books are great because they encompass, they have some basic wisdoms for everybody. So this is a good I would say, point of reference while talking about justice for everybody.
Okay, done. Then thank you for the meeting. Thank you for inspiring discussion. Thank you, Professor Shannon Sullivan.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you,
Chris Skowronski. Thank you for this meeting, and see you next time in the next philosophical discussion.